either.
Well, with me this evening, we have a trio of currency specialists. First, Dr. Angus Armstrong, who is a Director of Macroeconomics at the National Institute for Economic and Social Research. He's also a visiting professor at Imperial College and a House of Lords Special Advisor on Scottish independence. Joining us from London is John Nugée, an economic commentator who has written for the Better Together campaign. The majority of his career has been at the Bank of England, his final post spent as Chief Manager of Reserves. He's also worked for the Hong Kong Monetary Authority. And last but not least, also in our Edinburgh studio, we have George Kerevan, who's also an economist, commentator and former SNP candidate. Well, Angus Armstrong, let's start with this issue about sovereignty, that in his speech, Mark Carney, while not wanting to directly answer the question of whether he thought a currency union was a good or a bad idea, said it would involve ceding national sovereignty. It all depends, I suppose, on how you interpret what that means.
Yes, and ultimately, of course, this is for the Scottish people to decide in 9 months' time. But the issue of sovereignty is one that goes back to Mark Carney's valedictory speech that he gave in Canada about a year ago, when he pointed out that to have a successful monetary union, there has to be a mechanism that whereby when things go bad in one part of the union, the other part of the union can actually make some sort of financial transfer to it to sort of bide it over the difficult times, and vice versa. So there's a philosophical question here of what does that really resemble what people think is going to be independence? And then there's a practical question of, well, how would you actually do that, particularly since one part of the union is 10 times the size of the other?
Right. I just want to pick up on what you just said, because it's not really been concentrated on since Mark Carney spoke. He did make a big thing about fiscal stabilizers. In other words, the fact that at the moment in the United Kingdom, if one part of the UK is doing badly, then money automatically flows to it through the social welfare system. That obviously wouldn't exist for Scotland if Scotland became independent. Now, what I was unclear is he suggesting, do you think that you can't have a currency union unless you have the automatic stabilizers, in other words, a united social welfare system? Or was he suggesting that perhaps there would have to be some mechanism in place whereby there could be special transfers from one region of the UK to the other in the event of problems?
What he was suggesting is successful monetary unions, the sort of lessons from history, are areas such as, he brought out the example of Canada, the United States. When accidents happen and things go wrong, which of course one year they occasionally do, then it's best if there is a mechanism whereby you have these cross-border transfers to smooth things out. Now, just saying that doesn't mean to say it can't happen. The next question really becomes, how would one approach doing that between two sovereign states? He's not saying that it can't be done, but he's saying this is something which is new and would have to be thought through about how you do this between sovereign states.
Well, George Kerevan, what do you make of that? Again, make the point that this hasn't really been focused on, but yet it was a big part of Mark Carney's argument. And if we, obviously, the SNP itself argues that one of the reasons for voting yes is to have a different social welfare system from the UK. But if you do that, then these fiscal stabilizers, as he called them, simply don't work anymore. So how do you get around that?
Well, the first thing to say is that the problem occurs if you've got what economists call an asymmetric shock. If something happens to one part of the economies that are linked in a common currency and not to the others, which is exactly, of course, what happened in the Eurozone. I think after 300 years of reasonably strong integration between the UK, different bits of the UK, I think an asymmetric shock is highly unlikely in the present circumstance.
Well, hang on, it's eminently imaginable. Let me give you one scenario. Scotland has lots of oil money, the rest of the UK doesn't, and there's a big fall in oil prices. It has an effect on Scotland that it wouldn't have on the rest of the UK. That's an eminently feasible proposition. I mean, remember, we're talking over the long term. It's entirely possible that sort of thing could happen.
But Gordon, that happens at the moment. And when we've had different parts of the UK having different economic problems, right? They have lacked at a regional level the fiscal powers to actually create the kind of incentives for their individual businesses in order to grow. Now, countries like America or Canada have actually given quite sophisticated devolved fiscal powers, which Scotland does not have, in order to get over some of that problem. So the argument for dealing with asymmetric shock is if you have fiscal levers that you can apply directly to business incentives, that helps. Can I also say that the other thing that Carney was underlining, which is an important issue, is what happens if in any of that triggers, any of those asymmetric problems triggers a banking crisis in one part of the common currency or another. Surely it is better, because you've got a banking crisis that are cross-border, whether you have a monetary union or not, and given the Scottish banks and British banks are highly integrated, if there was a crisis, it would be across the border, whether or not there was a currency union. But a currency union would actually create the institutions that allow a banking crisis to be dealt with by both countries. It's not the SNP or the independence movement is trying to
let's move on to banking in a moment.
But what it's trying to say is let's create the institutions where we can deal with these problems in common.
Okay. Well, John Nugée, what do you make of this? I want to concentrate on this idea of fiscal stabilizers, because once you have two different welfare systems, those stabilizers, as I understand it, just wouldn't work anymore. Now, is it satisfactory, do you think, to argue, as George Kerevan does, that somehow fiscal powers that Scotland would have if it was independent would trump the effect of not having those fiscal stabilizers?
I think they would in any small crisis, and clearly the provinces of Canada, to use Mark Carney's home country as an example, have considerable autonomy, indeed more than Scotland does at the moment. The question I think we need to look at is whether they would have enough firepower in a big crisis. And whatever we build as one nation or two has to survive not just small crises but big crises. It appears to be the case that banking crises happen perhaps once in a generation, perhaps once in 50 years. No regulator will tell you that they will never happen again. And whatever we build is not for the short term. Whatever we as one or two nations put together is got to survive the storm. And I think I agree that Scotland could have more powers to handle short-term fluctuations and small fluctuations, and indeed that's behind some of the push for what was one of the options originally of Devo Max. But to have enough power to withstand a major storm as an independent country without fiscal transfers from London asks a great deal of the other parts of a stabilizer that Mark Carney talked about in the banking union, the movement of capital and the movement of people. And I think that is the challenge. To build a system which survives a really big storm is much more challenging.
All right. Now, less grandiose issue, Angus Armstrong, that arises from this ceding sovereignty as well. I mean, the SNP seem to accept that there would have to be some sort of pact. It would have to agree the stock of debt to GDP that Scotland would be allowed to have. It would have to agree the public deficit, sector deficit that Scotland would be allowed to have. What scope does that leave for the levers that the SNP, in fact George Kerevan's just referred to them, say they want to have? I mean, for example, could you have a pact like that and still run a corporation tax rate that was lower than the rest of the UK?
Well, let me just point out that when this pact is negotiated and agreed, there's a couple of issues that the negotiators will want to bear in mind. The first is that either party could actually leave the currency union. So the white paper quite rightly makes clear that it's up to the Scottish people in future elections to determine whether an alternative money arrangement might be suitable. So that's very clear. The Scottish government have stated that. That, of course, would also hold true for the rest of the UK. And so you have to find some constraints which are going to be binding, but somehow allow for the fact that it is possible that one day one side might choose to leave, which is the nature of sovereignty. So that's one thing they're going to have to do. The second thing, the constraints are going to have to bear in mind that one of the two parties essentially has 90% of the vote on most issues. So, you know, as we found out in Europe, the smaller parties tend to have to stick to the rules, and the bigger parties...
So, but just putting it bluntly, in view of you, would something like, for example, a different corporation tax rate, the SNP's big proposal on tax is to have a lower rate of corporation tax, is your understanding that under the kind of arrangement that would have to be involved, effectively London would have to give permission for that or it wouldn't happen?
Well, the first thing to say is I'm not involved in the negotiations, obviously, but these are exactly the sort of things that negotiators would presumably want to have a look at, as well as setting the overall envelope for the budget. The negotiators would like to look at the composition of it as well, because clearly joining some sort of union where you allow competitive advantage through changing taxes, which is not really competitive advantage, that's just changing taxes, that would come into question, I'd imagine. All right.
John Nugée, something Angus Armstrong referred to a moment ago, isn't there a democratic issue here? I mean, OK, people in Scotland can decide to be independent, but no one has asked people in England and Wales and Northern Ireland whether or not they want to be in a currency union with Scotland. So shouldn't the political parties which stand for election in the rest of the UK be saying, I don't know, well, after the 2015 general election, we'll have a referendum on whether or not to have a currency union? I mean, after all, imagine if a British government said, oh, we're going to join the euro and we won't have a referendum.
I think you make a good point. And to a certain extent, I expect the 2015 general election in the UK, with Scotland, of course, because by then, whatever the result of the referendum, Scotland will not yet have left following a yes vote. But whatever government is formed out of a 2015 general election will be the ongoing government of a continuing UK after independence, and will have the responsibility of negotiating terms with Scotland on currency union and indeed everything else. So I would expect it to play a very big part in that election. And it makes for a very interesting dynamic that the two parts of our country speak at different times. The referendum in Scotland comes first, and then the rest of the country can opine on how to deal with the result of that. Everybody in the UK knows that Scotland has the vote on whether they wish to be independent, but the rest of the country then has the chance to reflect on how that independence is formed and what relationship the rest of the UK wants to build with an independent Scotland. Now, those of us who want to see a productive union will hope that the governments negotiate responsibly. But it's in the hands of the electorate, and in particular in the hands of the continuing UK electorate, to form the government which will conclude those negotiations. Yeah,
George Kerevan, though, is it just a case of forming the government? After all, I mean, no matter what the result of the referendum is, and even if all the parties had something about this in their manifestos in the 2015 general election in the UK, it would be a fairly minor event. The argument for having referendums is that when it's an issue of constitutional change, which this would be. I mean, potentially the sovereign wealth of the remainder of the United Kingdom would be on the line in this, just as the sovereign wealth of Scotland would be. So shouldn't the parties be saying, we'll have a referendum on it, rather than saying there may or may not be negotiations? It shouldn't really be up to them, should it?
Well, it's certainly peculiar that the big three London parties are steadfastly trying to ignore the fact that there's this major constitutional issue going on that affects the whole of the UK, and you have the Prime Minister refusing to debate Alan Salmon and saying, well, it's an issue for Scotland. Clearly it isn't. Now, you can't actually have a referendum for the other parts of the UK in a sense if that led to them saying no and Scotland wanted to say yes to leave. I mean, clearly if Scotland wants to leave, it can leave.
No, I don't mean in Scotland leaving the UK. What my suggestion was that should Scotland vote yes, there could be a referendum in the rest of the UK on whether the rest of the UK wanted a currency. Yeah, I mean, it's absolutely up to people in Scotland to leave, but obviously a currency union affects people in the rest of the UK as much as it affects people in Scotland. Therefore, shouldn't they have a right to have a say in a referendum as well?
Well, I have no problem with that, Gordon. In fact, I think one of the things that will flow from Scottish independence is that actually the English might actually get a parliament back instead of being the one of the nations of the United Kingdom, Great Britain, that doesn't actually have a formal say.
Listen, we're running out of time. John Nugée, I just wanted, because of your background, to elevate you to the Treasury, if I may, just for a very short answer. If you were in the Treasury and you were looking at an independent Scotland, from the point of view of the rest of the UK, and you were asked the question, is it a good idea for the rest of the UK to negotiate a formal currency union, what would your answer be?
I would have to look very carefully at why I was putting my taxpayers at risk for a foreign country. I would have to say to myself, I belong to a country, or I serve a country, which does not share sovereignty on its money matters very easily. We have refused as a country, as the United Kingdom, to go into the euro because we don't like sharing our finances with foreign countries. And I would have to ask myself, what is so different Now, clearly Scotland is different. It is closer. It is, at the moment, more integrated. Is that a sufficient difference?
All right.
Or does the English desire to maintain control trump it? One thing is very clear. Scotland, out of this referendum, may gain some sovereignty. England, out of this referendum, if it means entering a currency union with a foreign state, will lose some sovereignty, and it may choose not to.
All right, look, we'll have to leave it there. Thank you all very much indeed.